The wind over the Moscow front does not blow. It carves. It sculpts the snow into razor-edged drifts and scours the faces of men until their skin cracks, like old porcelain. This is the winter of 1942, a winter that has just begun to taste of something other than despair. At a forward airfield, the cold is a living thing, seeping through wool greatcoats, freezing the breath in lungs. But in a windowless bunker that serves as a command post, the air is thick and febrile. It smells of nervous sweat, cheap tobacco smoke, and the sour tang of dried ink on operational maps. The maps tell a new story, a story of retreating German lines, of panic-stricken enemy columns caught in the snow. The Red Army is pushing back. A desperate, hungry hope has taken root. A plan is born on these maps, not a cautious probe, but a surgical strike of breathtaking ambition. A senior officer's finger, calloused and stained with nicotine, stabs at the town of Vyazma, a crucial railway knot deep behind the German main line. The idea is simple and brutal. While cavalry and infantry grind forward from the east, the elite of the Soviet military, the airborne corps, will be dropped like a steel fist into the enemy's soft rear. They will cut roads, seize bridges, sow chaos, and meet the advancing forces in a glorious link-up. The German salient will be severed, strangled, destroyed. The officer's voice is flat, final. The operation is approved. It will be the largest airborne drop in history. Outside, the men chosen for this historic blow are oblivious to the scale of the gamble. They are the desantniki, paratroopers. They move with the swagger of an elite, their blue berets and striped undershirts hidden beneath winter uniforms. Their training ground is a field of frozen mud. They leap from the backs of stationary trucks, shouting, "Za Rodinu!" Their bodies slamming into the impacted earth. Their weapons are light, designed for mobility, submachine guns with round drums, sharpened entrenching tools, bundles of grenades. They are told the link-up will come in days. They believe it. Their commander watches them. Kombrig Kazarin is a man whose youth has been burned away by command, leaving only a core of grim endurance. He has read the operational orders. He has also read the appended logistics reports, the ones stamped secret. The numbers do not add up. There are not enough transport planes. The planes that exist are obsolete TB-3 bombers, slow and vulnerable, or a handful of Lie-2s. The men have no specialized winter gear for a high-altitude drop. Their medical supplies are a joke. They have no mortars, no anti-tank rifles, no heavy machine guns. They are being sent as infantry, but without an infantry's tools. Kazarin writes a final blunt memorandum. He lists the shortfalls. He requests a delay, a reinforcement, a reconsideration. The reply comes not in writing, but in person. A political officer from the front staff, a man with eyes the color of a winter sky, visits him. The officer does not discuss logistics. He speaks of historical necessity, of the irreversible tide of victory, of the party's absolute faith in its airborne soldiers. He speaks of heroes and of traitors in the same calm, measured tone. The message is understood. The spear must be thrown, even if the shaft is cracked. Kazarin folds the memorandum and burns it in an ashtray. The smoke is acrid, a taste of failure swallowed before the battle even begins. Among the paratroopers, young Lieutenant Sokolov checks his weapon with ritualistic precision. He is a former physics student, a man who finds comfort in order and predictable forces. The war for him is a clear equation. Fascist aggression must be met with righteous force. He has volunteered for the airborne, drawn to the purity of the concept. A direct, decisive strike at the heart of the problem. He polishes the bolt of his PPS until it gleams, reciting verses from Mayakovsky under his breath, building a fortress of ideology against the low, cold dread in his stomach. He does not see the sullen, hollow-eyed infantrymen trudging past the airfield perimeter, back from the line. These men glance at the well-fed, eager desantniki with a look that is not envy, but a kind of weary pity. Observing it all is Lydia. She is a military correspondent, but her hands, now holding a notepad, are a surgeon's hands. She served in a field hospital during the retreat from Minsk. She has seen what shrapnel and frostbite do to young bodies. She looks at Sokolov and sees not a future hero, but the specific anatomy of a femoral artery. She looks at the thin straps of the parachute harnesses and thinks of dislocated shoulders, of spinal compression fractures. She is here to write about courage, but her memory is an archive of screams and amputated limbs. Her professionalism is a sheet of ice over a deep, black lake of horror. The night before the operation, the airfield is a landscape of eerie contrasts. Bonfires crackle, painting the snow in hellish orange. Men huddle around them, some laughing too loudly, others sitting in absolute silence, staring into the flames as if reading their future. One young soldier, a boy from a collective farm with huge peasant hands, quietly vomits behind a fuel drum, his body shaking not from illness, but from pure animal terror. His squad leader, a scarred veteran of the Finnish War, wordlessly hands him a canteen of water and a piece of hard cheese, his grip firm on the boy's neck, a silent transfer of strength. Kazarin makes his final rounds. He stops by a group of sergeants, not offering platitudes, but asking about the condition of their boots, the packing of their emergency rations. His authority is not based on inspiration, but on a perceived competence, a sense that he might, somehow, know a way through the coming hell. He catches Lydia's eye across the tarmac. For a second the masks slip. He sees the doctor in her gaze, the assessor of mortality. She sees the terrible burden in his, the man who has signed the death warrants. They look away, simultaneously. At the meteorological shack, a junior lieutenant is arguing, his voice a desperate hiss. He shows his superior a chart tracing a swirling mass of isobars moving toward the drop zone. A storm. It's developing right here. Visibility will be 0. Wind shear. The senior meteorologist, a man with the resigned face of a prisoner, does not look at the chart. He looks at the orders on his desk, stamped with the seal of the Front Military Council. "Your forecast," he says, his voice empty, "is for clear skies and moderate winds. Amend the chart." The young man's protest dies in his throat. He picks up a pencil, his hand trembling. He does not amend the chart. He destroys it, drawing a new one, a lie that will guide thousands of men into the abyss. The engines start before dawn. The sound is not a clean roar, but a convulsive, coughing thunder that shakes the frozen ground. The monstrous silhouettes of the TB-3s seem too frail, too antiquated to bear such a mission. Ground crews, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, wave the first plane forward. Kazarin is in the lead aircraft. As he climbs the metal ladder into the fuselage, he pauses. His hand goes to his chest pocket, feeling the hard edges of a small, framed photograph beneath the layers of wool and cloth. He does not take it out. He simply presses it once against his heart. A secret, silent apology. Then he ducks inside, and the door is shut, sealing him in a tube of cold metal and darker cold anticipation. One by one, The giants trundle down the runway, lurching into the air with palpable strain. They do not climb with purpose, but lumber upward, heavy with men and fate. They circle, forming a loose, ragged constellation in the pre-dawn gloom. Then they turn west, toward the front line, toward the unknown vortex of weather and war. Below, Lydia stands on the frozen field, the prop wash tearing at her coat. She watches the last navigation light vanish into the swirling darkness. The sound of the engines fades, absorbed by the vast, hungry night. All that is left is the relentless carving wind, and a silence so profound it feels like a verdict. The spear, forged in hope and fear, tempered by lies and necessity, has been launched. Its target is the heart of the enemy. Its flight path leads through a gathering storm. The night inside the aircraft is a black, vibrating coffin. The roar of the engines is a physical force, a constant assault on the eardrums that makes thought fragmented and communication a series of shouted barks and hand signals. The air is frigid, a metallic chill that seeps through the floor and bites at exposed skin despite the layers of clothing. The smell is a potent mix of high-octane fuel fumes, oil, damp wool, and the sharp, sour scent of human fear. The men sit packed together on hard makeshift benches along the fuselage, their parachute packs bulky and awkward between their knees. The red jump light glows like a malevolent eye in the darkness. Each jolt of turbulence sends a collective shiver through the line, a silent wave of tension. Lieutenant Sokolov clings to the webbing above him, his knuckles white. He tries to focus on the mission parameters, the rally point, the road he is to seize. But his mind is a blank map. The verses of Mayakovsky have deserted him, leaving only the hammering of his own heart, a frantic counter-rhythm to the engine's drone. He looks at the face of the man opposite him, a boy from his own company, and sees his own terror reflected back at him, magnified. The boy's lips are moving, whispering what might be a prayer or a curse to his mother in a distant village. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, Kombrig Kazarin stares into a void. Beyond the windshield, there is nothing. No stars, no horizon, no distinction between earth and sky. Only a swirling, opaque blackness. The pilot, a man with deep grooves of fatigue etched around his eyes, curses monotonously under his breath as he peers at his instruments. The compass needle swings drunkenly. The airspeed indicator is unreliable. The promised landmarks, a river bend, a specific forest line, do not exist in this formless dark. They are flying blind on faith and dead reckoning. A tiny, vulnerable metal box hurled into chaos. The radio crackles with sparse, panicked transmissions from other planes in the formation. Voices distorted by static cut through the noise. Leader, this is Swallow 3. I have lost visual. Severe icing on the wings. Stormfront. Impossible to hold course. The commands from the ground, if they come at all, are brief and contradictory. The carefully planned flight plan is disintegrating in real time, a complex equation erased by the violent, unpredictable hand of nature. Then, the first tracers rise from the darkness below. Not neat lines of light, but angry, glowing fireflies that seem to float lazily upward before streaking past the windows with horrifying speed. The Germans are not surprised. Their flak batteries, forewarned by the sheer noise and perhaps by radar, have opened up. The black night below erupts in sudden, silent flashes of orange and white, followed seconds later by concussive thumps that slam against the fuselage like the fists of giants. The plane shudders violently. A piece of metal, torn from somewhere, screams past a window. The interior is plunged into a strobe-light nightmare of blinding flashes and deep, consuming blackness. The jumpmaster, a veteran sergeant with a face like weathered leather, watches the light. It remains a steady, hellish red. They are off course. They are in the wrong place. They are flying through a storm of steel. But the orders are absolute. The green light will come. His jaw is clenched so tight, a muscle pulses in his cheek. He looks at the young faces turned toward him, waiting for the signal to step into oblivion. He sees not soldiers, but children sent to do the work of men in a machine that has already broken. Suddenly, the green light flickers, then glows with a sickly, artificial intensity. The jumpmaster's roar is ripped away by the engine's scream, but his arm slashing downward is unmistakable. Go! What follows is not a coordinated deployment. It is a frantic, chaotic expulsion. Men lurch to the hatch, pushed by those behind them. There is no time for a final check, for a reassuring nod. Sokolov is in the middle of the line. He feels a shove at his back, and then he is tumbling into the roaring, freezing maelstrom. The shock is absolute. The slipstream snatches him like a rag doll, whipping his limbs, stealing his breath. The noise of the plane vanishes, replaced by a howling wind that fills the universe. He plummets, disoriented, spinning. The ground is invisible. There is only the black up, the black down, and the terrifying sensation of accelerating into nothing. He pulls the ripcord. The deployment is a savage, bone-jarring jerk that slams his harness into his body, knocking the air from his lungs. Then, relative silence. The wind is still there, but it is a scream now, not a roar. He swings wildly under the canopy, a pendulum in a mad clock. He looks down, hoping for the familiar shapes of fields and forests from the briefing maps. He sees fire. Below him, the earth is a patchwork of orange hells. A transport plane, a Lie-2, is a comet of flame streaking across the landscape before it vanishes behind a hill with a silent, distant flower of explosion. Another TB-3, its wing sheared off, spirals down in a slow, macabre ballet. Parachutes dot the sky, but they are not the orderly pattern of a successful drop. They are scattered across dozens of kilometers. Some drift helplessly toward the burning wrecks of their own aircraft. Others are caught in the gale force winds and dragged sideways at terrifying speed. He sees one chute collapse, its lines severed by shrapnel, its occupant falling away into the dark without a sound. Sokolov's own descent is a battle. The wind is trying to kill him. It drives him toward a dense black mass that resolves into a forest of ancient, towering pines. He pulls on the risers, trying to slip, but his training is useless against this elemental force. The trees rush up to meet him. He crosses his arms over his face, closes his eyes, and braces. The impact is a series of brutal, snapping collisions. He crashes through upper branches, the sound of tearing silk loud in his ears, then slams into a thick limb that cracks against his ribs. He hangs there, suspended 15 meters above the frozen ground, his parachute tangled in the bone-like arms of the pine. A sharp, blinding pain flares in his side. He can taste blood in his mouth from a bitten tongue. He is alone. The silence, after the cacophony of the drop, is a ringing, profound emptiness, broken only by the moan of the wind in the branches and the distant, sporadic chatter of machine gun fire. The glorious spear has shattered in midair. Its fragments are now scattered, lost, and bleeding in a frozen German forest. The mission is over before it has begun. The struggle for survival has just started. Lieutenant Sokolov hangs in the darkness, a broken doll in a frozen tree. The pain in his side is a hot, focused agony, a stark contrast to the all-encompassing cold that begins to seep into his limbs. He moves cautiously, testing his bones. Ribs are cracked, maybe broken, but not splintered. He is not impaled. This small mercy feels monumental. With fingers numb and clumsy, he unsheathes his knife and begins sawing at the parachute risers. The thick, frozen cords resist. Each movement sends fresh jolts of pain through his torso. The fabric, once a symbol of winged freedom, is now a shroud trapping him in the canopy. It takes an eternity of sawing, panting, and biting back cries of pain before the final cord snaps. He falls, hitting the lower branches and then plunging into a deep, powdery snowdrift. The impact drives the air from his lungs and whites out his vision with fresh pain. For a long moment he lies there, staring up at the ragged silhouette of his parachute, caught in the branches, like a ghostly, defeated flag. The silence is absolute and terrifying. He forces himself to move. Survival is a drill, a series of steps. He unbuckles his harness, shrugging off the dead weight. He checks his weapon. The PPSH is caked with snow. He clears it with trembling hands, the routine action a tether to sanity. His pack is still on his back. He has a few magazines, grenades, a dry crust of bread, a tin of Tushonka, and a small flask of medical alcohol. No winter camouflage, no shovel, no radio. The map in his pocket is useless. He has no idea where he is. He begins to walk, driven by a single directive from training: find the rally point. But which way? The wind has died, leaving a pre-dawn gloom so thick it feels like walking through gray wool. Every shadow is a German patrol. Every snap of a frozen branch is a sniper's shot. He is no longer a lieutenant, a physicist, a patriot. He is a hunted animal, every sense screaming, pain his constant companion. After an hour of stumbling through knee-deep snow, he hears a sound that is not natural, a low, guttural moaning. He freezes, bringing his weapon up. The sound comes from a small clearing. There, a figure is sprawled, one leg bent at an impossible angle, a Soviet paratrooper. Sokolov approaches, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs. The man is conscious, his eyes wide with pain and terror. It's the young boy from the plane, the one who was whispering. His face is a mask of frost and agony. Leg. It's gone.
I can't feel it, the boy gasps. Sokolov looks. The boy's boot is shattered, the foot clearly broken in multiple places from a bad landing. He will never walk. The rally point is kilometers away, through forests crawling with the enemy. The unspoken truth hangs between them in the freezing air. Leaving him is a death sentence. Taking him is a death sentence for them both. Sokolov's idealism shatters. This is the clear equation of war: one life or two. There is no heroic solution in the manuals. He gives the boy sips from his flask, not water, the harsh alcohol making him cough. He takes the extra magazines from the boy's webbing. He gives him his own grenade. The boy understands. His eyes fill not with accusation, but with a terrible resigned gratitude. Tell my mother, in Saratov. Sokolov nods, a promise he knows he will never be able to keep. He cannot bear to hear the name. He leaves the boy with the grenade clutched to his chest, a final pitiful defense. Sokolov walks away, and each step feels like a betrayal of everything he thought he was.
The physicist in him is dead. A colder, harder creature is being born in its place. The dawn, when it finally leaks through the oppressive cloud cover, reveals a landscape of silent horror. The forest is littered with the debris of the shattered core. Sokolov finds a body still suspended in its harness, neck broken, swaying gently in the breeze. He passes a crater where a plane met the earth, a blackened scar surrounded by twisted metal, and things that were once men. He sees a trail of blood leading to a foxhole where a paratrooper has crawled to die alone. He is not the only one moving. Like magnetic fragments drawn toward a weak signal, other survivors emerge from the trees. They materialize one by one, spectral figures in torn uniforms, their faces gray with exhaustion and shock. A sergeant, with a bloodied bandage around his head. 2 privates, boys who look no older than 16, clinging to each other for warmth and courage. A cook, still clutching a large field kettle, as if it were a sacred object. They form a ragged, silent group of 7. No officers, no communications. They have rifles, a single light machine gun with little ammunition, and a collective hollow-eyed stare. They decide to move east, toward the front, toward the promised link-up. They have no other direction. They move in a loose tactical file, the sergeant taking point out of instinct rather than order. They are not a military unit. They are a pack of survivors, the scattered, breathing corpses of an army that never landed. Their mission is no longer to capture Vyazma. Their mission is to see the next sunrise. The grand, historic operation has been reduced to this: 7 lost men, pain, cold, and the crushing weight of a promise broken before it was made. The forest watches them, indifferent, and the vast, occupied territory stretches out before them, a hungry maw waiting to swallow them whole. The small band moved through the forest like ghosts, leaving shallow, hurried impressions in the snow that the wind began to erase almost immediately. They were not soldiers on a mission anymore. They were a single organism governed by a primal nervous system of fear and cold. The sergeant, a man named Gromov, whose pre-war life had been spent herding reindeer in the far north, led with an animal's quiet instinct. He could read the forest in ways the others could not: the alarm call of a jay, the subtle disturbance of snow on a low branch, the way sound carried differently in the still, frozen air. He was their anchor to a world that still had rules. Lieutenant Sokolov's cracked ribs were a furnace of pain with every breath, every stumble over a hidden root. The physicist in him was gone, shattered in the pine tree. In its place was a raw, calculating survivor. He found himself cataloging their resources with a grim precision that had nothing to do with ideology. 7 men. 43 rifle rounds per man on average. 200 rounds for the DP machine gun, carried by the larger of the 2 young privates. A boy they called Kolya. 8 grenades total, 1 pot, no medical supplies except Sokolov's flask of alcohol, 3 days' worth of hardtack and tushonka, if stretched to the breaking point. Their most dangerous deficit was time. They were dressed for a swift operation, not for surviving the deep winter in the enemy's rear. The cold was a patient, insidious thief, stealing feeling from fingers and toes first, then clarity from the mind. On the second day, they found the first sign that they were not the only fragments of the shattered spear. A column of gray smoke, thin and deliberate, rose from a ravine ahead. Gromov signaled a halt. They melted into the trees, watching. For an hour, nothing moved but the smoke.
Then a figure emerged from the ravine, a scarecrow in a torn airborne smock cradling a rifle. He moved with a painful slowness, scanning the trees not with a soldier's tactical eye, but with the desperate hope of a castaway searching for a sail. Sokolov recognized the posture of command before he recognized the man. It was Kombrig Kazarin. They emerged from hiding, a tense, silent reunion. Kazarin was alone. His face was gaunt, aged a decade in 2 days. A deep cut, clumsily stitched with what looked like fishing line, ran from his temple to his jaw. His eyes held none of the measured authority of the airfield. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the machinery of his command disintegrate in front of him, who had stepped over the frozen bodies of men he had ordered into the sky. He looked at the ragged group, at Sokolov, and there was no salute, no assumption of command. Only a grim, shared acknowledgment of the catastrophe. Kazarin led them into the ravine. Here, the Ghost Brigade found its first, terrible mustering point. 20 more men were scattered around a small, smokeless fire dug into the earth. They were a portrait of ruin. One man sat endlessly rocking, his hands wrapped in bloody rags, his frost-bitten fingers blackened. Another coughed thick red phlegm into the snow, a wound in his lung whistling with each breath. A junior lieutenant, his arm in a sling made from a parachute cord, was trying to assemble a broken radio from 3 different shattered sets, his movements frantic and futile. They had one heavy weapon, a single anti-tank rifle, PTRD, its massive barrel leaning against a tree like a useless monument to a war they were no longer fighting. Kazarin had not been idle. He had gathered these men. He had imposed a brutal discipline of silence, of sentry duty, of boiling pine needles for a pathetic tea that staved off scurvy. He had taken the maps from the dead and the living, and using a captured German pencil, had begun to draw a new, horrifyingly vague map of their reality. They were not near the planned drop zones. They were scattered over a sector 50 kilometers wide, deep inside the German rear. The front line was a myth, a distant, receding rumor. The promised cavalry strike was nowhere. The sounds of battle they heard were not the thunder of their salvation, but the sporadic, cruel punctuation of German clearing operations hunting them down. That night, under a sky of endless, starless black, Kazarin gathered the few remaining officers and sergeants. There was no bunker, no map table. They huddled in the ravine, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Kazarin spoke in a low, blunt monotone. The offensive, he said, had stalled. The link-up was a fantasy. They were on their own. Their new mission was not to attack, but to exist. To survive as a military entity for as long as possible. To become a phantom in the German side, a rumor of resistance that would force them to divert troops, to look over their shoulders. They would cease to be an airborne corps. They would become partisans, but partisans without a friendly population, without supply lines, without hope of relief. Sokolov listened, the last of his ideological fortifications crumbling to dust. This was not the war of righteous counterstrikes. This was the war of the trapped wolf, gnawing off its own leg to escape the steel jaw of a trap that had already snapped shut. He looked around the circle at the faces illuminated by the faint, hidden glow of the fire. He saw no defiance, only exhaustion, and a kind of weary acceptance. The grand, historic operation had vanished, leaving behind only this: 30 starving, wounded men in a hole in the ground, surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, with winter as their jailer, and death
as their only certainty. The tragedy was no longer a failure of strategy. It was the slow, cold, intimate dying of hope, man by man, in the silent, snowy woods. The ravine ceased to be a refuge and became a tomb if they stayed. Kazarin knew this with the same primal certainty that told him when a blizzard was gathering on the horizon. The German patrols, methodical and brutal, were tightening their noose. The frozen, starved corpse of one of their scouts, discovered 2 kilometers east with a bullet in his back, was the final proof. They were being hunted, and the ground was holding their scent. He gave the order to move, not as a military formation, but as a migration of the damned. They moved at night, a line of shadows against the deeper black of the forest, their progress measured not in kilometers, but in the agonizing slowness of silent footsteps and suppressed coughs. They moved westward, deeper into the German rear, a counterintuitive plunge into the belly of the beast. The front line was a death sentence. The vast, trackless forests and frozen swamps west of Vyazma offered the only slim possibility of oblivion. Their goal was no longer a point on a map, but a state of being. Disappearance. The world reduced itself to a brutal, elemental scale. The enemy was no longer just the German soldier. The enemy was the cold that crept into their boots and turned toes into black, necrotic wood. The enemy was the gnawing, hollow vacuum in their stomachs that no amount of pine bark or leather belt could fill. The enemy was the silence, a vast, oppressive blanket that smothered sound and thought, broken only by the crunch of snow, the moan of the wind, and the distant, terrifying bark of dogs. They became creatures of the forest. Gromov, the sergeant, taught them to read the lichen on the trees, to find the hidden springs where water still flowed under the ice, to construct zemlyankas, crude, half-buried dugouts, with concealed entrances and escape tunnels. Their uniforms, once a mark of elite status, became filthy, ragged things caked with mud and frost, blending with the bark and the earth. They shed the insignia of rank. Kazarin was no longer Kombrig, he was simply the Commander, a title that carried the weight of life and death decisions made over a shared tin of boiled, leathery horsehide they had scavenged from a killed German transport animal. Sokolov's transformation was internal and complete. The pain in his ribs had settled into a constant, dull ache, a familiar companion. His hands, once precise tools for equations and weapon cleaning, were now cracked and bloody, skilled with knife and snare. He found a grim, mathematical satisfaction in the economy of survival. He calculated the caloric yield of a handful of frozen berries against the energy expended to gather them. He designed more efficient snow shelters. His physicist's mind applied to the problem of thermal insulation. He kept a mental ledger of their remaining ammunition, a depreciating asset that could never be replenished. His heroism, the fantasy that had propelled him from the university into the sky, had been stripped away. What remained was a fierce, animal loyalty to the men around him and a cold, relentless will to deny the enemy their corpses for one more day. The first death from the elements was a quiet one. The man with the wounded lung, the one who coughed red phlegm, simply did not wake up one morning in the Zemlyanka. He had faded in the night, his final breath a faint, bubbling sigh lost in the snores of the exhausted men around him. They buried him in the frozen ground, a shallow, hurried grave, marked only by a broken branch. There was no time for ceremony, no energy for grief. His boots, less worn than most, were passed to the soldier with the worst frostbite.
His remaining ammunition was distributed. His death was processed as a logistical event, a redistribution of scant resources. This functional callousness was the most horrifying part. It meant they were adapting. They were learning to live in the unlivable. Their first engagement as a phantom force was not an attack. It was an ambush born of desperate opportunity. A single German horse-drawn sleigh carrying supplies became separated from its convoy on a forest trail. Kazarin observed it through binoculars, his face expressionless. The calculation was instant and merciless. The two guards were young, bored, their rifles slung. The crates on the sleigh might contain food, medicine, ammunition, or they might contain paperwork. The risk of revealing their position was enormous. The benefit of not starving for another week was incalculable. He gave the order with a nod. The attack was swift, brutal, and silent. Knives and entrenching tools, not guns. It was over in less than a minute. The two German boys lay dead in the snow, their blood shockingly bright against the white. The partisans, for that is what they were now, fell upon the sleigh. The crates held tins of liverwurst, hard black bread, real bandages, and miraculously, a small crate of potato schnapps. It was a feast, a miracle, but the cost revealed itself immediately. One of their own, the cook who had clung to his kettle, had taken a bayonet slash to the thigh during the struggle. The wound was deep, the femoral artery nicked. He blied out in the snow next to the German provisions, his life soaking into the ground as his comrades stuffed their mouths with enemy bread. They took his share of the spoils. They took the German bandages and used them to staunch other, less critical wounds. They drank the schnapps, not in celebration, but as a sterile, burning fuel. They vanished back into the forest before the convoy realized a sleigh was missing, dragging their meager prize and their new, heavy burden of guilt. They had traded a life for liverwurst. They had become predators in a frozen wilderness, their humanity eroding with each passing day. Their war no longer for victory, but for the next meal, the next sunrise, the next shallow, unmarked grave. The Vyazma operation was a forgotten ghost. They were the ghosts it had spawned, haunting a forest that was slowly, patiently consuming them. The ravine ceased to be a refuge and became a tomb if they stayed. Kazarin knew this with the same primal certainty that told him when a blizzard was gathering on the horizon. The German patrols, methodical and brutal, were tightening their noose. The frozen, starved corpse of one of their scouts, discovered 2 kilometers east with a bullet in his back, was the final proof. They were being hunted, and the ground was holding their scent. He gave the order to move, not as a military formation, but as a migration of the damned. They moved at night, a line of shadows against the deeper black of the forest, their progress measured not in kilometers, but in the agonizing slowness of silent footsteps and suppressed coughs. They moved westward, deeper into the German rear, a counterintuitive plunge into the belly of the beast. The front line was a death sentence. The vast, trackless forests and frozen swamps west of Vyazma offered the only slim possibility of oblivion. Their goal was no longer a point on a map, but a state of being. Disappearance. The world reduced itself to a brutal, elemental scale. The enemy was no longer just the German soldier. The enemy was the cold that crept into their boots and turned toes into black, necrotic wood. The enemy was the gnawing, hollow vacuum in their stomachs that no amount of pine bark or leather belt could fill. The enemy was the silence, a vast, oppressive blanket,
that smothered sound and thought, broken only by the crunch of snow, the moan of the wind, and the distant, terrifying bark of dogs. They became creatures of the forest. Gromov, the sergeant, taught them to read the lichen on the trees, to find the hidden springs where water still flowed under the ice, to construct zemlyankas, crude, half-buried dugouts, with concealed entrances and escape tunnels. Their uniforms, once a mark of elite status, became filthy, ragged things caked with mud and frost, blending with the bark and the earth. They shed the insignia of rank. Kazarin was no longer Kombrig, he was simply the commander, a title that carried the weight of life and death decisions made over a shared tin of boiled, leathery horsehide they had scavenged from a killed German transport animal. Sokolov's transformation was internal and complete. The pain in his ribs had settled into a constant dull ache, a familiar companion. His hands, once precise tools for equations and weapon cleaning, were now cracked and bloody, skilled with knife and snare. He found a grim, mathematical satisfaction in the economy of survival. He calculated the caloric yield of a handful of frozen berries against the energy expended to gather them. He designed more efficient snow shelters, his physicist's mind applied to the problem of thermal insulation. He kept a mental ledger of their remaining ammunition, a depreciating asset that could never be replenished. His heroism, the fantasy that had propelled him from the university into the sky, had been stripped away. What remained was a fierce, animal loyalty to the men around him, and a cold, relentless will to deny the enemy their corpses for one more day. The first death from the elements was a quiet one. The man with the wounded lung, the one who coughed red phlegm, simply did not wake up one morning in the Zemlyanka. He had faded in the night, his final breath a faint, bubbling sigh, lost in the snores of the exhausted men around him. They buried him in the frozen ground, a shallow, hurried grave, marked only by a broken branch. There was no time for ceremony, no energy for grief. His boots, less worn than most, were passed to the soldier with the worst frostbite. His remaining ammunition was distributed. His death was processed as a logistical event, a redistribution of scant resources. This functional callousness was the most horrifying part. It meant they were adapting. They were learning to live in the unlivable. Their first engagement as a phantom force was not an attack. It was an ambush born of desperate opportunity. A single German horse-drawn sleigh, carrying supplies, became separated from its convoy on a forest trail. Kazarin observed it through binoculars, his face expressionless. The calculation was instant and merciless. The two guards were young, bored, their rifles slung. The crates on the sleigh might contain food, medicine, ammunition, or they might contain paperwork. The risk of revealing their position was enormous. The benefit of not starving for another week was incalculable. He gave the order with a nod. The attack was swift, brutal, and silent. Knives and entrenching tools, not guns. It was over in less than a minute. The two German boys lay dead in the snow, their blood shockingly bright against the white. The partisans, for that is what they were now, fell upon the sleigh. The crates held tins of liverwurst, hard black bread, real bandages, and miraculously, a small crate of potato schnapps. It was a feast, a miracle. But the cost revealed itself immediately. One of their own, the cook who had clung to his kettle, had taken a bayonet slash to the thigh during the struggle. The wound was deep the femoral artery nicked. He blied out in the snow next to the German provisions, his life soaking into the ground as his comrades stuffed their mouths with enemy bread. They took his share of the spoils. They took the German bandages and used them to staunch other, less critical wounds. They drank the schnapps not in celebration, but as a sterile, burning fuel. They vanished back into the forest before the convoy realized a sleigh was missing, dragging their meager prize and their new, heavy burden of guilt. They had traded a life for liverwurst. They had become predators in a frozen wilderness, their humanity eroding with each passing day, their war no longer for victory, but for the next meal, the next sunrise, the next shallow, unmarked grave. The Vyazma operation was a forgotten ghost. They were the ghosts it had spawned, haunting a forest that was slowly, patiently consuming them. The bundle from the sky did not bring salvation. It brought a virus, and its name was hope. The fragile, hardened equilibrium of pure survival shattered. The knowledge that the big land knew they existed, even if only as a coordinate for a risky mail drop, unleashed a torrent of repressed thoughts, of memories of warm beds, of women, of bread that was not half sawdust. It was a psychological toxin more corrosive than gangrene. The Ghost Brigade was now a collection of twitching, raw nerves. The sight of the U-2 vanishing into the low clouds had left a vacuum, quickly filled by desperate speculation and simmering mutiny. The next rendezvous point was a frozen lake, 5 kilometers to the north. For 2 days, the swampy forest echoed not with disciplined silence, but with whispered arguments and the ugly sound of men breaking under the strain of a deferred future. Kazarin became the focal point of the collapse. His authority, once rooted in the grim necessity of his decisions, now seemed like tyranny. The order to leave Kolya behind, the amputation, the relentless westward flight deeper into the maw, these were no longer seen as brutal necessities, but as the choices of a commander who had led them into hell and was now, perhaps, lost in it himself. His scarred face, once a badge of shared suffering, now looked like a mask of indifference. The younger survivors, those who had not fully shed their pre-war selves, looked at him with a new, dangerous emotion: hatred. The most vocal was a former university lecturer turned junior lieutenant named Misha. His glasses were long broken, held together by wire and grime, but his intellect had sharpened into a weapon. He gathered a small circle around the pathetic, smoky fires they now risked in their damp dugouts. He did not speak of disobedience. He spoke of logic. "We are moving west," he would argue, his voice a low, intense hiss. "Every step takes us further from the front. The Germans are consolidating for their spring offensive. Their rear is becoming a fortified zone. We are not phantoms. We are mice in a tightening cage. Kazarin is waiting for orders that will never come. Our only chance is east. Now. A small group, moving fast before the mud completely dries and their patrols solidify." Sokolov listened to these arguments, his own internal machinery whirring. He ran the calculations. Misha's logic was sound, militarily. The probability of a successful breakout for a small, mobile group was higher than for 20 emaciated men. But it was a logic that discarded the weak, the wounded, men like Gromov, whose frostbite had turned his feet into blackened, agonizing stumps. It was the logic of the sleigh ambush, elevated to a principle. It meant abandoning Kazarin's core, crumbling belief. that they must remain a unit, a symbol, however tattered, of the Red Army on enemy soil. It meant accepting they were merely survivors, not soldiers. Anya, the silent partisan, watched it all. She said nothing, but her eyes followed Sokolov, waiting to see which man he would become. She had seen her village make such choices. Who would hide? Who would betray? Who would share the last potato? This was the same calculus, written in blood and frost instead of fear and hunger. The crisis exploded on the eve of the second aerial rendezvous. Kazarin announced he would take 2 men to meet the plane. He expected it to bring ammunition, perhaps a new radio, orders. Misha openly challenged him. "You will take the strongest," Misha stated, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. "You will take the last of our fighting strength to wait for a ghost, while the rest of us sit here, waiting to be surrounded. It is not tactics. It is a death wish." For a long moment, the 2 men stood facing each other in the clearing, the damp twilight clinging to them. The rest of the men formed a ragged, tense circle around them. It was no longer about rank. It was about faith. Faith in the system that had thrown them away versus faith in the savage, individual will to live. Kazarin did not shout. His voice was like the grinding of stones deep in the earth. "If we cease to be a military unit," he said, his one good eye locking on Misha's, "then every man we left behind, every man who died waiting for the link-up, died for nothing. They become just meat. We are all that is left of the operation. We are the record. If we scatter, the 4th Corps truly ceases to exist. And if we die here obediently, we cease to exist anyway." Misha shot back, his composure breaking. "I choose life. Even a life in a penal battalion on our side of the line is life. This is a slow, forgotten suicide." Kazarin's hand did not move to his pistol. That would have been the end. Instead, he did something worse. He turned his back on Misha. He looked at the faces of the men, at Sokolov, at Gromov, at the hollow-cheeked boys. "I am going to the lake," he said, his voice carrying a final, terrible weight. "Those who are still soldiers of the Red Army will follow their commander. Those who are not may try their luck to the east. I will not stop you." He turned and walked into the trees toward the frozen lake. He did not look back. For a minute no one moved. The forest dripped. Then, one by one, men began to shift. Sokolov felt Anya's gaze on him. He looked at Misha, whose face was a storm of defiance and terror. He looked at Gromov, who simply shook his head, a man who would die in place rather than be abandoned again. Sokolov made his choice, not out of loyalty to Kazarin or to the motherland, but because the physicist in him, the last surviving ember, understood a terrible equation. Misha's path was rational, but it led back to a world that had already erased them. Kazarin's path was insane, but it was the only one that maintained the fragile, terrible meaning of their 8-month Calvary. To break now was to admit the forest had won completely. He picked up his rifle and followed Kazarin into the gloom. 10 others did the same, moving like sleepwalkers. Misha and 5 others stood their ground, then melted away eastward, into the gathering dark, without a sound. The Ghost Brigade had finally fractured, not from German bullets, but from the unbearable weight of its own forgotten tragedy. The rendezvous at the lake awaited, not with salvation, but with the next inevitable dose of bitter truth. The frozen lake was a vast gray eye staring up at a starless sky. Kazarin, Sokolov, and the 10 who had followed him lay at the tree line,
their bodies pressed into the half-frozen mud at the water's edge. They were not a military formation anymore. They were the last handful of grit at the bottom of an hourglass, waiting for the final turn. The air was still, heavy with the smell of wet pine and decay. The silence was a physical pressure. Kazarin did not look at the men beside him. He scanned the sky to the east, towards the front, a line that existed now only in theory. His face in the gloom was a cliff of bone and scar tissue, all humanity eroded away by the long winter, leaving only the stark geology of will. He clutched a small flare pistol, its weight absurd in his skeletal hand. It was their last link to the world that had birthed and then abandoned them. Sokolov lay beside him, the cold of the earth seeping through his rags. He felt nothing. Not fear, not anticipation, not even the dull ache of his long-healed ribs. He was a vessel emptied of everything except a final, morbid curiosity. He wanted to see what form the end would take. Would it be the stutter of German MG-34s from the opposite tree line, or the distant hum of the U-2, bringing another crumb of hope that would only prolong the agony? He found himself hoping for the machine guns. It would be a cleaner equation. Anya was there too. She had followed Sokolov without a word, a shadow he could not and would not shake. She did not lie down. She knelt, perfectly still, her head slightly cocked, listening to the forest in a way none of them could. She was their canary in this frozen coal mine, and her stillness was more unnerving than any sign of alarm. Then, from the east, a sound. Not the sputtering putter of the U-2, but the deeper, throbbing drone of multiple engines. German bombers returning from a raid. The men tensed, their hands whitening on their weapons. But the sound passed overhead, fading to the west. The lake was silent again. An hour later, the sound returned. This time it was different, lighter, single-engined. It grew from a murmur to a distinct, labored buzz. A small, dark shape materialized against the slightly less dark sky, weaving unsteadily. The U-2. It was alone. Kazarin raised the flare pistol. His arm trembled, not from weakness, but from the monumental absurdity of the gesture. He fired. A single red flower bloomed in the sky, illuminating their faces in a sudden, hellish glow before sputtering out. The plane acknowledged with a waggle of its wings and began its descent. It was not a landing. It was a controlled crash. The skis hit the rough, slushy ice. The plane bucked violently, slewing sideways, and came to a shuddering stop 100 meters from shore. The pilot did not cut the engine. He kept it at a nervous, rattling idle. The door slid open. This time, no bundles were thrown out. A figure jumped down into the snow, then another. The pilot gestured frantically. He had brought 2 passengers in, and he was taking 2 out. That was the math. The 2 figures began trudging toward the tree line. As they neared, the moonlight caught their faces. One was a stranger, a haggard man with the look of another group's commander. The other was Lydia, the military correspondent turned surgeon. She carried a small medical kit, her face pale and set in the professional mask Sokolov remembered from the airfield a lifetime ago. The meeting was a grotesque pantomime. There were no salutes, no reports. Kazarin and the other commander exchanged a look that held an entire encyclopedia of shared catastrophe. Lydia's eyes swept over the men emerging from the trees. Her surgeon's gaze catalogued the ravages, the gauntness, the scurvy-ridden gums, the blackened frostbite, the hollow, feral eyes.
She saw Sokolov, and for a second her mask slipped, revealing a vertiginous horror. The boy physicist was gone. A walking skeleton with ancient eyes stood in his place. She spoke quickly, her words chopped by the engine noise. She had volunteered for this run. She brought antibiotics, sulfa powder, a few syrettes of morphine. She also brought the final official word. The spring thaw had bogged down all major operations. No ground offensive to link up with them was planned. The airborne operation was considered concluded. Their new orders: break into small groups and attempt to exfiltrate eastward to the front line, or continue partisan operations at their own discretion. She handed Kazarin a folded paper. It was not a rescue plan. It was an authorization for their own dissolution. Kazarin took the paper. He did not open it. He simply nodded. The other commander and a wounded signaler, the one with the bad lungs who had somehow clung to life, were chosen to be evacuated. They stumbled toward the plane. There were no goodbyes. As the U-2's engine rose to a screaming pitch, struggling to pull its overloaded frame from the slush, Lydia turned back to Sokolov. She reached into her coat and pressed something cold and hard into his hand. It was her surgeon's scalpel, wrapped in a sterile cloth. A tool for cutting, not for healing. A final pragmatic gift for the wilderness. Then she ran, scrambling back into the plane. The door slammed shut. They watched as the plane lurched forward, gained speed, and finally lifted, its wheels skimming the tips of the pines before vanishing into the night, taking the last whisper of the big land with it. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. It was the sound of the last thread being cut. Kazarin slowly unfolded the orders. He held them up, but it was too dark to read. He crumpled the paper into a ball and let it fall into the mud at his feet. He looked at the remnants of his command, 11 men, including Anya. They looked back at him, waiting for the final order, the final meaning. He pointed east, toward the distant, unseen front. Not with the flourish of a commander launching an attack, but with the weary gesture of a man pointing toward a distant, stormy shore. There was no speech, no inspiration. The journey would take weeks. They would have to cross roads, rivers, fortified lines. Most would die. Sokolov felt the weight of the scalpel in his hand. He looked at Anya, then at Kazarin's retreating back as the commander began to walk, following his own order. He thought of Misha, who had chosen the rational path of self-preservation. He thought of Kolya and his grenade. He thought of the forgotten thousands whose names were already ash in some archive. He did not think of home. Home was a fairy tale. He took a step forward, then another, his broken boots sinking into the muck. He followed Kazarin into the dark, away from the lake, toward the distant thunder of artillery that was not meant for them. They moved in single file, shadows dissolving into the greater shadow of the forest. They were not heroes returning from behind enemy lines. They were ghosts, finally leaving their haunted ground, carrying nothing out of the long tragedy but their scars and the silence. The Vyazma airborne operation was over.